Welcome to the Libido Lounge, where we focus on all things love, lust, and libido. We believe that fabulous sex is important to health as exercise and good food. Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode on the lounge. I'm your Libido Lounge host, Dr. Diane, and today we are having a discussion about climax, about orgasm, about the different types of orgasms, about what is behind orgasm. And one of the things that I want to make sure to address is if you are somebody that has never experienced an orgasm, or if you used to experience orgasms and no longer are able to, that is all, we're going to cover all of that today. We're going to cover the why behind sometimes how that can happen, as well as talk about strategies and tools and so much more. But I want to orient us to two different components of this conversation on climax. One, there's absolutely amazing research about all of the hormones and everything that gets released at orgasm. So we get increases of our happy hormones like serotonin and dopamine. We get increases of oxytocin, which is that feel-good hormone that helps us to re-regulate our stress response, helps us feel calm and happy and peaceful and connected to the people in our lives that we love, in particular in that moment, oftentimes our partner, if we are with our partner at the time of orgasm. So there's so many amazing benefits like that that will come from orgasm. And we also want to remember that a lot of those benefits too just come from intimacy, right? So even if you're struggling with having an orgasm, even if you're struggling with that, we can still get a large amount of oxytocin, serotonin, dopamine release, even from just giving long hugs. So I like people to know this because as you are getting back into turning your libido on and revving it up, or maybe you don't have a partner and you're not interested in masturbation, which I do encourage because there's a lot of health benefits from it. But let's say you're not interested in any of those things. There's still the ability to get all of these amazing hormones in other ways. But one of the best ways, as far as the large amount of oxytocin that gets released, is truly with orgasm. So with climax, we're going to talk a lot about female climax today because there's just a lot of misunderstanding about female climax and a lot of confusion, right? And so much of this, I think, is related to what we are taught, how we're taught about sex. Most of the time when we're talking about sex, most of us, the best education we got oftentimes is in grade school. And largely it was just something that we do as humans to procreate. And of course, there's so much more to sex than procreation. There's so many more benefits to sex than procreation. That is just one thing that can happen with intimacy. Now, because oftentimes we are not taught about that, we are not taught about what does it take to actually reach climax. We see so many times in medical textbooks that the description of how we get to climax and orgasm is really described for women very, very similar that it is described for men. And we all know from our own experiences that that's probably not very true for most of us, right? That the experience of getting to climax is actually quite different for females as compared to males. And so because of that, because of the lack of training around that, oftentimes there is this like shame we feel around climax. There's this shame we feel around maybe not being able to get to climax, or this shame we feel around like, why is it taking me so long, or why is it taking my partner so long? And oftentimes in a hetero relationship, there can be scenarios where the man might feel a little bit bad, right? That he's not able to get his partner to climax every time, or sometimes, or at all, or faster, or any of that. And we're not taught about the nuances of how the arousal process and the climax process is very, very different. So let's break down why it could be hard to get to climax. So there's a few different things. We want to definitely consider any sort of nerve damage. So there can be nerve damage. We know that the nerves of the pelvic floor really influence orgasm. We know that the pudendal nerve really influences orgasm and pleasure. We know that the vagus nerve, which is the 10th cranial nerve, will really influence pleasure as well. So all of these different nerves can influence our pleasure. And what's really important to understand is the pudendal nerve is the main nerve that goes to the clitoris. And since we have these different types of nerves, these different nerves that go to different parts of female anatomy, what winds up happening is in studies where they sever a nerve, they can act in animal studies, they can actually still cause orgasm by triggering another nerve. So that's something to understand, is that if there's trauma to nerves, that can actually influence orgasm, but we have backup, supply around bringing these nerves to different areas. So it might be, for example, if the pudendal nerve is injured, which goes to the clitoris, it might be much more difficult to have a clitoral orgasm. But there's still vaginal orgasm available. There's still cervical orgasms available, right? There's still different orgasms for different erotic tissue or erogenous tissue, around the body. So because of that, we want to think, okay, well, nerve damage can definitely create a problem. And so with that, we have to think about what could damage the nerve. So yes, there can be trauma, trauma like car accidents, for example, structural trauma where something's impacting the body can absolutely cause things, but even basic things like blood sugar. So a lot of people with blood sugar issues know the term peripheral neuropathy, where there's like numbness and tingling in the hands and the feet. Guess what? Our genitals are also involved in that. And we see, there's even one study that shows that for those with diabetes or blood sugar imbalances, there's an 11% chance of an increase of peripheral neuropathy at the clitoris, and there's a 24% chance of decreased ability to orgasm, right? So fundamentally, when we're having issues and we're having challenges with orgasm, we want to come back to the root causes, right? So we want to think about structure. We want to make sure that our structure is in alignment, since we do have so many nerves that come out of that pelvic bowl area. If our pelvis is out of alignment, let's say, like for me, an example of how that could happen would be, I'm an avid snowboarder, right? So occasionally, not often at this point, but occasionally I still fall. I'm still pushing myself and I might land on my butt. And in that case, that would be an example of a simple life, trauma around, I just landed on my butt a little hard, and all of a sudden I could potentially throw my structure out of place, pinching one of those nerves of the pelvic floor and preventing that nerve signal to my entire genital erogenous area, right? So that could lead to something like lack of sensation or orgasm challenges, anorgasmia. And so one of the things structural wise, we want to make sure our bones are in place. We want to make sure our pelvic floor is really solid. And then we also see there's a huge influx of blood flow that really is needed to engorge the tissues. And so, for example, that just like we have this nerve called the pudendal nerve, which is actually signaling the clitoris part to feel, right? So it's part of that feeling, that ability to sense enjoyment in the clitoral tissue. Well, part of that also comes from part of the clitoral abnormality. Say if we're having an orgasm problem, then we could say that there could be lack of blood flow. And the pudendal artery is the artery that is responsible for bringing that blood flow to the clitoris. And not just the clitoral head, not just the part that you can see, but also to the clitoral legs, as they're called, which extend through our labia. And so in all of that is the pudendal artery, the pudendal nerve, which bring energy, which bring that blood flow to that area. So we really want to make sure blood flow is really good. That's where we get into nutrients like citrulline. So blood flow, nerves. And I think it's really important to also name that when we're talking about climax, when we're talking about orgasm, especially if somebody is anorgasmic, or especially if you haven't had an orgasm in a long time, there can be this pressure, right? So I mentioned the pressure a little bit. There can be this bidirectional pressure. And I've actually even seen that in myself, right? Where I have had a couple partners in the past. I get so hyper focused on the end result. And then I feel this pressure that if they're not going to, that I'm going to let them down, right? If I don't get there. And then that creates that level of pressure that all of a sudden can be stressful, right? So it's like, oh, we tend to not want to let our partners down. So there's that level of then, well, I feel so much pressure. You can feel so much pressure to orgasm because of this expectation that you might not orgasm just because of that pressure. So it's really important that as you are experimenting with some of the things that I'm going to talk about next, the goal is to enjoy. The goal is to feel pleasure. The goal is to relax. The goal is to be present in your body. Orgasm and climax is an act. One of the things I talk a lot about is it's an act of being present. If our mind is not present on our body and our body sensations, then it's very difficult to orgasm because we're not actually feeling the pleasure of what's happening there. So we do want to keep our mind on the pleasure. That's an extremely important component of this. And so if we can just focus on that without worrying about that end result, that typically will help a lot. Now, I wanted to bring up the concept when we're talking about climax of different types of orgasms. For example, a G-spot orgasm, a cervical orgasm, a clitoral orgasm. There's other orgasms that have been found as well. The point of what I want to say here is I have kind of a different opinion of what some other people say online. Like some people, when they're talking about different orgasms, they talk about cervical orgasms as being this pinnacle orgasm of this place to get to of oh, it's like the orgasm of all orgasms. And my perspective on orgasms really is that they're all wonderful and they all provide healing. And they might, they do different things and from a standpoint of experience, right? So for many people, cervical orgasms can feel very ethereal. It almost can feel like one is leaving their body. It can feel like one is connected to something that is so much bigger than them, right? So different types of orgasms can produce different results, right? Some can lead to more shaking. Some can lead to more clenching, more contracting. Another orgasm myth out there is that all orgasms are rhythmic contractions. And no, studies have shown that not every woman will report rhythmic contractions when she's experienced and when there's other physical signs in laboratory studies, there's other physical signs of her having an orgasm. Contractions are there for most women, but not all. So that's another thing to understand is just like anything in health, just like anything in our bodies, we respond differently to different types of food. We respond to different types of exercise. We're all unique humans in this world. And our experience of climax and orgasm is all very different. And that's one of the take-home points I wanted to really make sure to say in this episode. And I wanted to say that because it's so easy to read online and to get oh wow, this holy grail of orgasms is a cervical orgasm, and I just have to get there. And it's an amazing experience, and it's also one of these things where you're not doing anything wrong if that's not an orgasm that you've had access to yet. And there are practices that you can do to begin to have more access. But I personally, the other point is I personally just don't believe that there's this one orgasm that's so much better than, all orgasms. Sometimes cervical orgasms are so intense for women that they just would rather prefer one of these other orgasms, right? And so the idea with that is allowing your own experience to be yours. And then another thing that I want to bring up with this whole process around intimacy, around climax, is the idea of radically having orgasms, right? Radical orgasms. And these types of orgasms, there's different people that use different terms for this, but I think these types of orgasms are brilliant for healing. And that's one of my favorite things about climax. That's one of my favorite things about intimacy is the health benefits they're so deep, and we're still learning so many things about the health benefits. But
So many of us as humans, all of us really, have different stories, different beliefs that guide our lives, right? And so many of these stories, sometimes they can cause us suffering, right? In sickness, people that have been sick for a long time oftentimes have the story of never going to be well, right? We can have the story of never being able to find love. We can have the story of our belly being too large and nobody ever loving us. We can have so many different stories. And these stories can create a lot of stress and they can create a lot of trauma and they can create a lot of stress hormones and a lot of anxiety. Well, we see in studies that one of the best ways to reprogram our brain is through a combination of changing our brain state and really dropping into a particular feeling. And so what we can do with radical orgasms is we can do both those things. So our brain state is changing the more the neurochemicals get released. And with that, we have the ability to reprogram and to have our partner help us reprogram our brain. So it's a beautiful thing, right at that point of climax, if you or your partner, both of you guys, can take turns whispering things into each other's ears that you want the other person, or the other person's trying to repattern, right? So if that point at climax, you're whispering into the other person's ear that they are just the most wonderful human, that they are the most beautiful human being, that the love is so deep, that you see all of these amazing qualities. And anything else that, say, you're trying to reprogram, that they are safe, that they are successful, that they are not an imposter, like anything that could come up, right? Those kind of things can be reprogrammed at that moment. And that feeling state, that's like a really, really can be a really tear-jerking kind of orgasm, because you're actually deeply reprogramming the subconscious. And this is one of the things that I feel like is oftentimes not talked about with the concept of climax. And so same thing, like when we're talking about, okay, well, if you have not experienced orgasm or you've lost your orgasm, where do you start? Well, start with making sure your structure is good. Pelvic floor health, we talk about that throughout this podcast on other episodes. Look at blood sugar, look at insulin, right? So make sure you do a fasting insulin, because insulin will oftentimes go out of balance before other markers, before glucose or hemoglobin A1C, these other blood sugar markers. So we want to make sure we're looking at insulin as well. And so you want to make sure that you are doing these things that are preventing your nerves from firing incorrectly. Make sure your blood flows good. Make sure you don't have high blood pressure, high cholesterol. All of those things can change that blood flow to the genital area. So, and then, working on those, but then also making sure that you're working on any of those mental stories, working on being present, and then working on feeling pleasure. So much of the time we hold tension in the pelvic floor. And another thing that I see is there's a huge relationship with clenching of the jaw to clenching of the pelvic floor. So if you're a jaw clencher, a jaw grinder, it's very, very likely that you're actually holding a lot of tension in your pelvic floor. Not only can that impact the nerves and the climax like we're talking about here, but that can also make it so that it just doesn't feel very good, right? It just doesn't feel that great. Some studies have shown that wands or vibrators used 3 times a week for 12 weeks can have a 5 times reduction of pelvic pain. And some of what's the thinking behind that, it's bringing more blood flow. It's helping that muscle that's maybe over tight to relax. And when we use various sorts of sexual massagers, sexual wands, oftentimes then we can get more blood flow. We can help that tissue relax, so we can begin to have more exciting and more euphoric experiences. So please do remember that this is sexy season. Sexy season is all summer long. And in sexy season, one of the things we're doing this year is we are giving a ton of things away for people that rate and review our podcast. So we want to get this word out. One of the best ways, there's not a awesome way in our world yet of talking about these really important topics. And so podcasts are really one of the best ways of getting information like this out to more people. And your ratings, reviews does really help us reach more people. And so if you rate us, if you review us, please take a screenshot of that, send us that in, and we have workshops and bonuses, and one lucky winner will win a deep dive, $1,000 value for my 21-day desired Libido Jumpstart course. So we go through a ton of things in that. We get some time interfacing, and it's super wonderful. So please do make sure you send in your reviews so we can get you in our raffles. And that's really it. So let me know if you guys have any other questions about this topic. Always excited to do follow-ups on this and bring in more guests on this topic as well. And this is Dr. D signing off, reminding you to always stay classy, always be sexy, and always remember to be a little badassy. We'll see you next time.